Gravity claimed her first. The floor of the water closet rushed up, hard wood striking soft flesh. St. Petersburg, November 1796. Catherine the Great collapsed in silence, unaware that a horse scandal would soon be birthed from this moment to shock Europe. The Winter Palace held its breath. Valets found her twisted on the floor, face dark with apoplexy, heavy as stone. There was no stallion, no perversion, just a dying woman and the smell of stale lavender and sickness. Nearby, an open inkwell sat undisturbed on her desk, its black contents reflecting the wavering candlelight. That ink would soon be weaponized to rewrite her end into a grotesque joke. Why did the most powerful woman in history suffer this specific indignity and death? And what terror did she inspire that made her enemies desperate enough to turn her into a beast? A lie travels faster than a coffin. If you enjoy these dark histories, leave a like and subscribe and comment below where you're listening from. And now, back to the story. The news left the Winter Palace on horseback, wrapped in leather satchels, shielded from the biting Russian wind. But truth rots quickly on the road. By the time the couriers changed horses at the Prussian border, the stroke had become a seizure. By the time the whispers reached the coffee houses of Paris, the seizure had become a monstrosity. The descent was not into a physical dungeon, but into the grime of public imagination. The French Republic, still bloody from its own revolution, needed a monster. They needed to prove that monarchs were not merely oppressors, but subhuman beasts. The open inkwell was no longer a tool of statecraft. It became a trough. Anonymous pamphleteers, men who had never seen the Neva River, began to construct the cage that would hold her legacy. They stripped away her conquests, her laws, and her modernization of the East. In their place, they forged a narrative of insatiable lust. They designed the machinery in their minds, the harness, the winch, the suspended beast. It was a mechanical impossibility, a physiological absurdity, yet they printed it with the certainty of Scripture. The ink soaked into the cheap paper, binding her name to a barnyard death forever. A lie requires a willing audience to breathe. While Europe laughed, St. Petersburg froze in a different kind of captivity. Her son, Emperor Paul I, did not weep. He had waited 42 years for this moment, pacing in the shadows of Gatchina Palace, nursing a cold hatred. He took control of the narrative with the precision of a jailer. He ordered the winter air to be filled not with eulogies, but with a correction of history. Paul did not just bury his mother. He resurrected her victim. He ordered the exhumation of his father, Peter III, the husband Catherine had deposed and who had died under hemorrhoidal colic 34 years prior. The crypt was opened. The air grew thick with the dust of decay and the sour tang of old bones. The court was forced to march. It was a procession of captivity. Paul demanded that the surviving conspirators, who had helped Catherine take the throne, now carry the regalia of the man they had murdered. They walked in silence, a forced penance, carrying the heavy golden crown behind a rotting coffin. This was the mercy Paul offered, a chance to honor the true Tsar, finally restored to light. But the price was absolute. To honor the father, they had to desecrate the mother. He placed Peter's coffin beside Catherine's in the funeral hall. He forced them to lie together in state, the victor and the vanquished, the Empress and the ghost. He bound them in death as they had never been bound in life, trapping her corpse in a final, humiliating marriage. The dead cannot defend their own names. The trial was not held in a courtroom. There was no judge in a powdered wig, no jury of peers, no wooden gavel striking a sounding block. The trial took place on the copper etching plates of London and the rough, ink-stained pamphlets of revolutionary Paris. The condition imposed upon her memory was absolute. She could be remembered as a usurper, a tyrant, or a conqueror, but she would not be allowed to remain a woman. To be a woman with intellect and agency was a violation of the natural order that the newly formed republics and founding monarchies could not abide. The prosecution offered a simple choice to the history books: admit she was a puppet of her generals, or admit she was a monster of unnatural appetites. There was no middle ground for a female autocrat. Catherine, in her letters and her life, had delivered her cold refusal decades prior. "I shall be an autocrat. That is my trade." She offered no apologies for the men in her bed. She did not weep for the expectations of the church or the morality of lesser minds. But the silence of the grave gave her enemies the final word. The pressure escalated with mechanical efficiency. First came the whispers of the Messalina of the north, comparing her to the Roman Empress of legendarily insatiable lust. These were soft blows, the kind aimed at any woman who dared to rule alone. But when those insults failed to diminish her stature, the attacks grew more visceral. They stripped away the humanity of her lovers, Grigory Orlov, Grigory Potemkin, Platon Zubov, and replaced them with a void that no human man could fill. The satirists needed something larger, something grotesque, to explain away her dominance. Ink stains the memory darker than blood. They invented the horse. It was not a random choice. In the visual language of the 18th century, the horse represented unbridled masculine power, military force, and the conquest of nature. To suggest Catherine required a stallion was to say that her ambition had outgrown the human race entirely. It was a calculated inversion of her greatest strength. The discipline she had used to modernize Russia, to partition Poland, to annex Crimea, the very greatness she had earned, was twisted into a biological defect. The why of the scandal was never about sex. It was about power. The myth was a weapon designed to neuter the terrifying reality of her competence. If she died crushing a horse, she was just a deviant fool. If she died of a stroke while planning to join the coalition against France, she was a geopolitical titan. The lie was the price Europe exacted for her success, her refusal to marry again, her refusal to share the throne, her refusal to be the little German princess she was born as. This was the armor that deflected their armies, but caught their slander. The very thing that made her untouchable in life made her vulnerable in death. She had used men for pleasure and politics, discarding them when they were spent. The satire punished this reversal of gender roles by having her crushed by the symbol of masculinity she sought to ride. The open inkwell that sat on her desk had been the source of laws that governed millions. Now, the ink of her enemies drowned out her edicts. The price was paid in dignity, the currency of kings. She had conquered the Ottomans, but she could not conquer the printing press. A legend built on filth is harder to tear down than a fortress of stone. The truth was not found in a stable, nor in the fevered dreams of French revolutionaries. It was waiting in the cold, clinical silence of the autopsy room, illuminated by the steady flame of a tallow candle. While Europe roared with laughter at the beast, a Scottish physician named Dr. John Rogerson performed the final, wordless rite of memory. He did not see a monster. He saw a 67-year-old woman, heavy with age, her legs swollen with edema, her skin pale and slack. There were no shattered bones. There was no internal trauma consistent with the violence of the rumors. There was only the quiet, devastating failure of the human machine. Rogerson moved with the precision of a man who had guarded her health for decades. He washed the body, he prepared the fluids, he dipped his quill into the inkwell, the same black pool that had birthed the rumors, and reclaimed it for the truth. He wrote in the medical register with a steady hand. He recorded the time, the symptoms, the cause. The enemy is not the grave, but the silence that follows. He noted the location, the small dressing room adjacent to the water closet. He noted the posture, collapsed on the floor, unable to rise. He noted the sound, the heavy rattling breathing of a brain drowning in its own blood. The diagnosis was apoplexy, a massive stroke. The greatness that had terrified the Ottoman Empire and partitioned Poland had been extinguished by a burst vessel in the brain, likely no larger than a grain of rice. This record was not published in the tabloids. It was filed away in the Imperial archives, a stack of papers bound in twine and sealed with wax. For centuries, these documents gathered dust, buried under the weight of the salacious myth. The physical reality of her death was preserved in the dark, waiting for a historian to break the seal. The excavation of the truth requires us to look away from the spectacle and look at the mundane. Modern historians examining the floor plans of the Winter Palace and the memoirs of her secretary, Adrian Grabowski, reconstructed the morning of November 17th. There was no horse. There was only a cup of strong coffee, a routine morning at the desk, and a sudden, crushing headache. The struggle was not with a stallion, but with gravity. The hidden truth is that the scandal was a psychic defense mechanism for her enemies. They could not accept that a woman who lived with such intellectual violence could die with such domestic banality. They needed the horse to make sense of her power, but the autopsy report remains the unshakable artifact. It stands as a silent monolith, rebuking the lie with the dull, gray facts of biology. The ink on the page dried centuries ago, but it holds the only version of the story that does not rot. Dead men tell no tales, but their ledgers scream. The Winter Palace still stands against the gray St. Petersburg sky, a monument of stone and iron, but the room where she fell is silent. The floorboards have been scrubbed, replaced, or covered. The smell of lavender and sickness is long gone, swept away by 2 centuries of drafts. The inkwell that sat on her desk is empty now, or perhaps it sits in a museum case, a sterile artifact behind glass. But the ink it once held did not dry, it metastasized. The medical records of Dr. Rogerson, precise and exonerating, were swallowed by the archives. They became ghost lines on yellowing paper, unread and unreferenced by the masses. The truth was erased not by fire, but by indifference. It is far more entertaining to believe in the beast than to study the stroke. The autopsy report is a blank entry in the public consciousness, a withheld truth that cannot compete with the spectacle. The witnesses are dust. Paul I, who tried to shame her in death, was strangled in his own bedroom 5 years later, another victim of the palace's brutal gravity. The French satirists who penned the lie are nameless skeletons in forgotten cemeteries. Yet, their whisper endures. It has outlived the empire itself. It travels through the digital veins of the modern world, a meme that refuses to die, turning the Empress of all Russias into a punchline. We return to that moment on the floor. Gravity claimed her body, dragging it down to the wood. But the scandal denied her that rest. It suspended her in a perpetual state of grotesque absurdity. The inkwell reflects our own faces now. We are the ones who keep the story alive, passing the lie from generation to generation like a dark heirloom. We choose the scandal because it makes the great seem small. It reduces a titan to a dirty joke, and in that reduction, we find a perverse comfort. The coffin traveled slowly, but the lie has never stopped running. It circles the globe, faster than any stallion, trampling the facts into the mud. Subscribe, hit the bell, and like. History does not remember what happened. It remembers what we prefer.